The story begins with a young woman, Sarah, who was pregnant and living with her husband, David, and his mother, Linda. They had been living together in a modest home for a few months. Sarah had always felt a little uneasy about her relationship with her mother-in-law, Linda. It wasn't that Linda was outright cruel, but there was a tension in the air whenever the two were together. Sarah had heard stories about her mother-in-law's fiery personality, but she had hoped that things would be different when she married David. After all, she wanted to build a peaceful life with her husband and support each other through the challenges of pregnancy. Linda, on the other hand, had always been somewhat overbearing. She had a certain way of doing things, and it was hard for anyone, especially Sarah, to meet her standards. Sarah tried to be respectful and patient, but it was clear that Linda didn't always approve of her. Every decision Sarah made, whether it was about the house, the food, or even her pregnancy choices, seemed to be met with criticism. Linda often made snide comments about how Sarah was handling her pregnancy and would frequently suggest that she should be doing things differently. Sarah tried not to let it bother her, but the constant remarks weighed heavily on her. David, caught between his mother and his wife, didn't always know how to navigate the situation. He loved his mother, but also adored Sarah. He wanted both women to get along, but the tension was obvious. There were days when he'd come home from work to find Sarah upset after yet another one of Linda's pointed remarks. But when he would try to step in, Linda would dismiss his concerns, insisting that she was only trying to help. It wasn't just the little comments that bothered Sarah. It was the way Linda seemed to think she had the final say in everything. Linda would often make decisions about the house without consulting anyone, and Sarah was left feeling like an outsider in her own home. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, Linda walked into the kitchen and made a comment about how Sarah was cooking the meal all wrong. She told her that she needed to make it in a proper way. It was the kind of remark that Sarah had learned to brush off over time. But this time, something inside her snapped. Her pregnancy hormones were making her feel more emotional, and the frustration she had been keeping inside started to boil over. The argument started as a small disagreement, just like so many others. Sarah tried to explain that she was following her own instincts about what worked best for her and the baby. Linda, however, wasn't having it. She raised her voice, calling Sarah's choices irresponsible. The tension between them grew, and it became clear that the disagreement was more than just about cooking. It was about control, respect, and boundaries. Linda was determined to impose her will, and Sarah was starting to feel trapped. The frustration that had been building for months finally erupted in this heated argument. David, hearing the raised voices, rushed into the kitchen to try to calm things down. But he was too late. Both Sarah and Linda were already in the middle of a fierce exchange of words. Sarah felt her heart racing, her stomach tightening, and she knew that things were getting out of hand. She wanted to say something, to stand up for herself, but in that moment, she felt small and powerless. The argument between Sarah and Linda had escalated quickly. Sarah stood there, her hands trembling as her heart raced. The tension in the room was thick, and it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She had tried so hard to stay calm, to keep the peace, but every time she thought she could move past Linda's harsh words, another comment would come that made her feel less than. Today, it was the way Linda had criticized her cooking, but it wasn't just about the meal. It was about her being undermined every step of the way. Linda, however, wasn't backing down. Her voice rose as she pointed out every little thing she believed Sarah was doing wrong. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had grown used to this, but it didn't make it any easier. The pregnancy made her emotions feel more intense, and she couldn't hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She wasn't just upset about the meal anymore. It was about the lack of understanding, the constant pressure, and the feeling of being alone in a house full of people. David stepped forward, trying to intervene as he had so many times before. He didn't want to see his mother and wife at odds. He cared about both of them, and it hurt him to see the tension between them. But as he tried to speak, both women talked over him. The arguments from the past flooded back, times when Linda had made her opinion clear and times when Sarah had felt like her feelings didn't matter. "I just want to do things my way, David," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "But she doesn't let me. I feel like nothing I do is ever good enough." David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Linda chimed in, her tone sharp. "It's not about being good enough. It's about doing things right. You're carrying my grandchild, and I want to make sure everything's done properly." Sarah flinched at the words. It wasn't the first time Linda had made it clear that she was the one who knew best. The underlying message of being judged and controlled had been a constant in Sarah's life since she'd moved in with them. She wanted to be the one to make decisions for herself, especially when it came to her pregnancy, but Linda seemed to think she was the expert on everything. Sarah tried to take a deep breath, but her frustration boiled over. "Stop telling me what's right and wrong," Sarah shouted. "I'm not a child. I'm an adult, and I need to make my own choices." Linda's expression hardened. The mother-in-law's stubbornness was no surprise to Sarah, but in this moment, it felt more intense than ever. The silence that followed was heavy. David stood between them, looking from his wife to his mother, clearly torn. It wasn't the first time he had seen them clash, but this argument felt different. Sarah was pregnant, and the emotions running through her were overwhelming. He didn't want to take sides, but he knew something needed to change. Linda was the first to speak again, her voice low but firm. "I'm only trying to help, but it seems you don't want it. Fine, do what you want, but don't come crying to me when things go wrong." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. It wasn't just the argument. It was the feeling of being dismissed. It was as if Linda had never truly seen her as an equal. Sarah had been trying so hard to prove that she could handle her own life and decisions, but it seemed like nothing she did would be enough. In that moment, Sarah felt the weight of everything crashing down. She wanted to leave, to escape the constant judgment, but she didn't have anywhere else to go. She was pregnant, and her husband was caught in the middle. All Sarah wanted was peace, but it seemed so far away. The argument that had started over something as simple as cooking had now become a full-blown confrontation. Sarah could feel the heat rising in her chest, her pulse racing. The more Linda spoke, the more her frustration boiled over. She had spent so long trying to keep the peace, trying to avoid confrontation, but now it felt like the floodgates were open. Every harsh word that came from Linda's mouth made her feel smaller, more helpless, and the emotional pressure weighed down on her like a heavy blanket. Linda, however, seemed to be unfazed. She had always been confident in her way of doing things, and she wasn't backing down now. "I'm not trying to control you," Linda said, her voice still stern. "I'm just trying to make sure everything goes well for the baby. You don't know what you're doing." The words cut deep. Sarah had always tried to take care of herself and her baby, but it felt like Linda was constantly undermining her. Each time Sarah made a decision, Linda would swoop in with advice, suggestions, and even criticism. It was as if she didn't believe Sarah was capable of making her own choices, especially when it came to her pregnancy. Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to hold back the tears. She was tired of feeling like she wasn't enough, tired of constantly being judged. David had been silent for a moment, trying to process everything happening before him. He cared deeply for both Sarah and his mother, but now he felt completely caught in the middle. He could see the hurt in Sarah's eyes, the pain that Linda's words were causing. But Linda wasn't the kind of person to back down, and David didn't know how to make things better without upsetting one of them. His heart ached, torn between the two people he loved. Sarah took a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm doing my best, Linda," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to handle everything, and I don't need you to remind me of every mistake I might make. I just need your support, not your criticism." Linda's expression faltered for a moment, but her pride quickly rose again. "You think I'm criticizing you. I'm trying to protect you and the baby." She didn't understand that the constant remarks and judgments weren't helping. They were only making Sarah feel more isolated. David finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Mom, Sarah's doing the best she can. She doesn't need you to tell her what to do all the time. We're a team, and we need to support each other, not tear each other down." But instead of listening, Linda's frustration seemed to grow. She shot David a sharp look, her voice hardening. "You're just taking her side, aren't you? You don't see what I see. I'm trying to help, and you're letting her make all the wrong decisions." The argument spiraled out of control. Sarah could feel her emotions running wild, her mind clouded by frustration, confusion, and hurt. Every word from Linda seemed to hit her like a stone. She felt small, like she wasn't in control of her own life. This wasn't the peaceful home she had imagined when she married David. She had hoped for love and support, not constant tension. David, equally torn, tried to step in again, his voice shaking with emotion. "Mom, please, I don't want to fight with you, but I can't watch you make Sarah feel worthless like this." But Linda wasn't listening. She was angry, and her words were sharper than ever. She was the mother, and she was determined to make sure everyone knew it. The clash between the two women seemed to have no end in sight. For Sarah, it was a breaking point. The pregnancy had already taken its toll on her body and emotions, and now it felt like the emotional weight of everything was too much to bear. As the argument raged on, Sarah could feel herself becoming overwhelmed. The tension in the room seemed suffocating, and she needed space to breathe. Without thinking, she turned and stormed out of the room, her emotions completely raw. The sound of David's voice calling her name barely reached her ears as she walked out the door, desperate to escape the chaos inside. She needed some air, some time to think, but most of all, she needed to feel like she was in control of her own life again. Sarah stepped outside, the cold air hitting her face as she tried to steady her breath. The arguments from inside the house were still echoing in her mind, and she felt like her chest was about to explode from the weight of it all. She had just walked out of a fight that seemed to have no end, and now she was standing in the quiet of the evening, away from the harsh words, but still feeling the sting. The emotional toll of the day had been overwhelming, and it was hard for her to sort through her feelings in that moment. She paced back and forth on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. The cool breeze of the evening helped to calm her nerves, but it didn't change the fact that she felt isolated, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had tried to make her pregnancy a peaceful experience, but now it felt like she was constantly fighting. First, she had to deal with the physical challenges of carrying a child, and now, it seemed like she was up against the emotional challenge of constantly being scrutinized by Linda. As she walked along the edge of the yard, Sarah's mind kept going back to Linda's words. It wasn't just about cooking or little comments anymore. It was about feeling like she was never good enough. Everything she did seemed to be wrong in Linda's eyes. Even when she tried to do things her own way, Linda would swoop in, trying to take over. It felt like Linda didn't trust her to make decisions for herself, and that hurt deeply. It made Sarah feel small, invisible, and inadequate. David had tried to defend her, but he hadn't been strong enough. Sarah had wanted him to step in and stand up for her, but instead, he tried to calm things down, caught between the two women he loved. Sarah knew he didn't want to take sides, but at that moment, she felt like she was fighting this battle alone. She longed for his support, not just in words, but in action. She needed him to stand firm, to show his mother that she was his priority, that he was willing to protect her. The thoughts spun in Sarah's head like a whirlwind, and she couldn't seem to find an escape from them. She missed the way things had been when she and David had first gotten together. There had been so much excitement about their future, about the baby they were going to raise together. But now, it felt like everything was overshadowed by this constant tension. Sarah had hoped that things would get easier once they started their own family, but it seemed like the opposite was happening. Linda's interference in their lives had become a barrier to the peaceful home Sarah had always dreamed of. After a few moments, Sarah took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing thoughts. She knew she couldn't keep walking away every time things got tough, but the emotions she had been holding in for so long were overwhelming. She had to face this head-on, even if it meant having another difficult conversation with Linda or David. But for now, she just needed a moment of peace, a moment to collect herself before she went back inside. She slowly made her way back to the house, her heart still heavy, but a little more at ease with the quiet outside. The house loomed in front of her, and as she walked through the door, she knew the next steps were going to be just as challenging. She could feel the tension still hanging in the air, but for now, all she could do was take it one step at a time. As Sarah stepped back into the house, the silence was almost deafening. The argument still hung in the air like a heavy fog, and though the heated words had stopped, the tension hadn't. She walked slowly through the hallway, her footsteps echoing, each one a reminder of how she was feeling, exhausted, frustrated, and uncertain. She had hoped for some peace, but everything still felt unsettled. The weight of her emotions was suffocating, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was fine. David was sitting on the couch, his head resting in his hands, looking just as drained as she felt. He glanced up when she walked into the living room, his eyes filled with concern but also frustration. He wanted to say something, but Sarah could tell he was holding back. He didn't want to make things worse. He was trying to figure out how to fix everything, but it wasn't that simple. Sarah knew he was torn between them. He loved both his wife and his mother, but there were times when his loyalty seemed divided, and that was one of the hardest parts for her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," David said quietly, his voice full of guilt. "I never meant for things to get this bad." Sarah looked at him, her heart aching. She could see the struggle in his eyes. He was apologizing, but she didn't want an apology. She wanted something more. She needed him to stand up for her. She needed him to show her that he was on her side, even if it meant standing up to his mother. "I don't need you to apologize, David," Sarah said softly. "I need you to be with me, to help me, to show me that you understand how this feels." David nodded, his expression a mix of regret and confusion. "I do understand. I don't know how to fix it. I don't want to lose either of you." "I'm not asking you to choose, David," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep feeling like I'm not part of this family. I'm carrying our child, and I need to feel supported, not like I'm being criticized at every turn. I want to make decisions for our family, and I want you to be with me in that." David's face softened, and for the first time that night, he looked at her with real understanding. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I've been letting things slide, hoping it would get better on its own. But I see now how much it's affecting you. I'll talk to my mom. I'll make it clear that we need space to make our own choices, especially when it comes to the baby." Sarah felt a small sense of relief at his words. It wasn't everything she needed, but it was a start. She could see that David was trying, and that meant more than anything. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling her heart ease a little. But as much as she wanted things to get better right away, Sarah knew it wouldn't be that simple. Linda's influence had been so strong for so long, and it would take more than a single conversation to change everything. Still, hearing David's promise gave her hope. They were a team, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like they were on the same side. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, quiet peace. The house felt different, still tense, but no longer as filled with the sharp edge of anger. Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could face it. As she and David sat together, the weight of the day slowly began to lift, and she allowed herself to relax for the first time in hours. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, the weight of the previous day still pressing on her chest. She hadn't slept much, her mind constantly replaying the argument with Linda and the conversations with David. Despite everything, she knew that today was the day things had to change. She couldn't keep living in this kind of emotional turmoil. She needed to feel like her voice mattered, like she was in control of her own life. And she needed David to be with her, fully, without hesitation. She spent a quiet moment in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, trying to center herself. The house was still. David hadn't woken up yet, and Linda was nowhere to be seen. Sarah felt a sense of calm, but it was only temporary. She knew that once the day began, things would inevitably stir again. She couldn't just ignore the tension anymore. It wasn't healthy for her, for David, or for their growing family. As Sarah was lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. David walked in, looking a bit weary, but he had a soft, apologetic smile on his face. "Morning," he said gently, his voice still thick with the weight of the previous night's conversation. "How are you doing?" Sarah looked up at him, feeling a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and still some lingering uncertainty. "I'm okay," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just trying to get my head together." David walked over and put his hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and comforting. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice steady. "I know things haven't been easy between us, and I haven't been there the way I should have been. But I want to change that. I'll talk to Mom today. I'll tell her that we need some space. You and me, we need to make decisions together. And I want her to understand that." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her at David's words. It was exactly what she had been hoping for. A real commitment to stand by her side, to protect their little family from outside interference. She nodded, appreciating his willingness to step up. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As the day unfolded, Sarah could feel the tension building again, but it wasn't coming from her or David. It was from Linda, who had been unusually quiet. When Linda finally made her appearance in the kitchen, it was as if she was walking on eggshells. Sarah could sense the change in her. Linda wasn't as quick to snap or criticize. There was an awkwardness in the air, a shift that both confused and comforted Sarah. She wasn't sure if it was because Linda was finally getting the message or if she was just waiting for the right moment to say something. David, sensing the moment was right, took a deep breath and spoke up. "Mom, we need to talk." Linda looked at him, her expression unreadable. She opened her mouth to respond, but David continued, his voice firm but calm. "I've been thinking, and Sarah's right. We can't keep going on like this. We need to set some boundaries. Sarah and I need to be able to make decisions for our family without feeling like we're constantly being criticized. I want to be able to do things my way with Sarah, especially with the baby." Sarah watched as Linda's face softened, and she could almost see the realization wash over her. For the first time, Linda seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. There were no sharp words or harsh comments, just a quiet acknowledgement of what David had said. Linda sighed and nodded slowly, her eyes flickering to Sarah. "I never meant to make you feel that way," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. I guess I've been trying to help, but I see now how it might have come across." Sarah, taken aback by Linda's admission, didn't know how to respond. She had never heard her mother-in-law speak this way before, apologetic, even slightly vulnerable. It was almost as if Linda was admitting defeat, though Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding a balance. "I'm sorry too," Sarah said softly, her voice tentative. "I've been trying so hard to keep things calm, but I think I've been holding in a lot of things that I should have said sooner." David looked between his mother and wife, his face a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The conversation had gone better than he expected, but he knew it wasn't over. This was just the first step. The real challenge would be making sure that everyone kept their promises and respected the boundaries they had set. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of hope. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, but maybe, just maybe, they were finally on the right path. As she looked at David, she realized that together they could face whatever came their way. The road to healing might be long, but it was one they were ready to walk together. The morning after their conversation, Sarah felt a small sense of relief. The air in the house was still tense, but there was a noticeable difference. David had made it clear that he was on her side, and for the first time in a while, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. But she knew that change wouldn't come overnight. Linda had always been a strong presence in their lives, and breaking old patterns would take time. Sarah couldn't let her guard down completely just yet, but the small steps that had been taken yesterday gave her hope. The day passed in an uneasy quiet. Sarah spent most of it in the living room, going through her pregnancy book, trying to distract herself from the whirlwind of emotions still swirling in her mind. Every now and then, she could hear Linda moving around in the kitchen or cleaning in the next room. The silence was awkward, but it was better than the shouting and tension that had filled the house the day before. Later in the afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting with David on the couch, his arm around her shoulders as they watched TV. She could feel his warmth, and in that moment, it was comforting to know that they were in this together. But the quiet was still heavy, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, for the next move to be made. David looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to talk to Mom again," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I know it's going to be hard, but I want to make sure she understands that we're a team. We're building our family, and she needs to respect that." Sarah nodded. She appreciated his willingness to take charge, to stand firm on their decisions. But she also knew that this wasn't an easy conversation for David. He had been caught between his love for his mother and his loyalty to her, and it wasn't a position anyone would want to be in. "I trust you," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet emotion. "But I need you to make it clear. This can't keep going on. We need to set boundaries, or it's just going to keep hurting." David squeezed her shoulder gently, offering a reassuring smile. "I know. I promise. I'll make sure she understands. We're going to be okay." Sarah wanted to believe him, and part of her did, but the past few months had shown her how quickly things could change, how quickly Linda could dominate a conversation or make her feel small. As much as Sarah wanted peace, she also needed her independence. She needed to know that her choices mattered, that she wasn't just a guest in her own home. The next few hours were filled with quiet tension. Linda stayed mostly out of sight, as if giving David and Sarah space to talk. Sarah couldn't help but feel uneasy. Was Linda angry? Was she going to try to fight back? Sarah wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't good for her, for the baby, or for her relationship with David. Something had to change, and soon. As the evening came, Sarah sat at the dinner table, trying to push her anxiety aside. She had made a simple meal, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would bring a sense of normalcy to the house. David and Linda sat down together, the two of them exchanging quiet words. Sarah didn't know what was being said, but she could feel the weight of the conversation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, David turned to Sarah. "Mom and I talked," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think she understands. She's agreed to give us the space we need." Sarah felt a wave of relief flood over her. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding onto that anxiety, hoping that David's words would be enough to create change. But hearing him say that things were finally being understood made her believe that maybe this could work. Maybe they could find a way to move forward, without the constant tension that had defined their lives for so long. Linda, who had been quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said softly, her voice lacking the usual sharpness. "I never meant to make you feel like this was my house, or that you weren't in control of your own life. I was just trying to help, but I see now that I was overstepping." Sarah looked at her mother-in-law, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't the apology she had expected, but it was enough. She nodded slowly, offering a small smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I just want to be able to make my own choices, and I need you to understand that." David looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. It hadn't been an easy conversation, but they had made it through. And though things weren't perfect, they were finally on the path to healing. Sarah knew that this wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something better. A new chapter, one where she could finally feel like she was in control of her own life and her own family. The days that followed felt different. There was still tension in the house, but it wasn't the suffocating kind that had hung over Sarah for months. Instead, it was a quiet kind of uncertainty, an unfamiliar calm where things were still adjusting. Linda had pulled back from her usual ways, giving Sarah and David more space to make decisions, and though Sarah appreciated it, she couldn't shake the feeling that things hadn't completely changed yet. But one thing was clear: there was progress. Sarah and David started talking more, discussing their future, their plans for the baby, and how they would navigate life together without the constant interference. It felt good to finally be able to speak freely without the fear of being judged or criticized. But at the same time, Sarah couldn't ignore the fact that Linda's presence still loomed over them, like a shadow. It wasn't easy for her to let go of the years of dominance and control that Linda had held over their home. One afternoon, Sarah sat in the living room, quietly reading a book. David was at work, and Linda had gone out for a walk. The house was peaceful, and Sarah allowed herself a moment of stillness. She felt more relaxed than she had in weeks. It was a relief to know that she and David were on the same page now, and that they were taking steps to create the kind of family they wanted. But there was still a part of her that wondered if everything was truly going to be okay. Just as Sarah was starting to sink into the quiet comfort of her thoughts, the front door opened and Linda walked in. She looked different, calmer, softer, less guarded. Sarah wasn't sure what to expect, but she was prepared for anything. She put down her book and greeted Linda with a cautious smile. "Hey, Sarah," Linda said, her tone surprisingly gentle. "I've been thinking about everything, and I know I've made mistakes. I've been hard on you, and I'm sorry for that. I know it hasn't been easy for you, and I want to do better." Sarah looked at Linda, taking in her words. She hadn't expected an apology like this, but it was the kind of apology she had been hoping for. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a step toward something better. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady. "I've been trying to figure things out too. It's not always easy, but I just want to feel like I'm part of this family, like my choices matter." Linda nodded, her expression sincere. "I get that. I just wanted to be involved, but I see now that I've crossed boundaries. I respect your decisions, and I want to support you, not control you." Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't that all of her doubts had disappeared, but hearing Linda speak so openly about her mistakes gave Sarah hope. It was a sign that things were changing, that there was a chance for a healthier dynamic between them. "I appreciate that," Sarah said, feeling the tension between them start to ease. "I know you want what's best for me and for the baby. I just need to make my own choices and feel like I'm not being judged all the time." Linda gave a small, understanding smile. "I understand, and I'll do my best to support you without overstepping." The conversation wasn't a magical fix, but it was progress. It was a new beginning for Sarah, David, and Linda, a chance to rebuild trust, to find a way to live together with respect and understanding. Later that evening, as Sarah and David sat down for dinner, the atmosphere in the house felt lighter. The tension had shifted, and while things weren't perfect, there was a sense of optimism. They were finally moving forward as a family, and it felt good. David reached across the table, taking Sarah's hand in his. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice full of conviction. Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words sink in. They had made it through the hard part, and now it was time to embrace the future, together. As the evening continued, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just because Linda had apologized, or because David was on her side. It was because she finally realized that, no matter what happened, she and David could handle anything together. They were a team, and nothing would tear them apart. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with love, communication, and respect, they could create the family they had always dreamed of. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hopeful about the future.